conversation with a younger mate of mine recently. He didn't have much experience with women and was wondering about a good way to possibly meet someone. He knew that I had a lot of women in my life and what my thoughts were about meeting women in bars. When he mentioned all to me, I could totally see his inexperience with social situations on how he legitimately believed that you could meet reputable women in bars in today's social settings. I immediately told him about the concept of meeting women or even men at bars as something of a relic from a bygone era, and yet for some people it still persisted. They honestly believed that you could be a good person in a bar setting, and I mentioned that you don't really do that sort of thing anymore, but he brushed off my concerns for his safety and considered bar hopping as a legitimate way to meet a woman. Before he actually decided to pursue the concept of meeting women through bars any further, I mentioned to him an experience that I had when I was his age. Many years ago, through circumstances, I had met a nurse, and the both of us were mutually attracted to one another, and we decided to meet up. She immediately recommended a bar that we could socialize at. It took me aback because at the time I never really met up with a woman at a bar for a first date, or even meeting a woman in a social situation like that at all. She had also mentioned that she would be there once her shift was done at a nearby hospital. The time that she mentioned was somewhat late, but I decided to be accommodating of her because she was a nurse after all, and I assumed that was perhaps the only time that she could meet. I was more understanding back then as well as naive, so once again I really didn't think too much about it. As the day and night came for the date, I took my local metro to the address she had given me, and I got there within a few minutes ahead of the scheduled meeting time. I decided to wait outside for her so that we could enter the bar together. As I waited for her outside, but she didn't appear. I was somewhat concerned as I later gave her a call to see what the situation is, and she actually mentioned that she was already inside. Apparently, she got let out of the hospital early that particular night and she just decided to head to the bar. I at least figured that she could have somehow contacted me and let me know that she was already inside, but regardless, I went inside the bar and soon found her sitting and already drinking. As I sat next to her and formally introduced myself, she nodded and greeted me. I noticed that she didn't have a small glass near her. She literally had an entire bottle near her shot glass and was sipping from it. The bartender would periodically ask if she was doing alright. I'd learn why later on, so for then I decided to order a basic drink as we started to talk and mingle. She explained that she worked the evening as well as night shifts at the local hospital in the psychiatric ward. She dealt with patients who had advanced cases of mental diseases, in particular schizophrenia. So she mentioned times that she would have patients literally banging their heads against the walls of the asylum walls, so hard that they could be heard meters away, as well as in the rooms that they were banging their heads on. There were bloodstains on the walls as well. Oftentimes she mentioned that when she'd come into the room, she'd be shouted at and insulted by the patients. There was even a recent incident with her in that a patient took his feces and smeared it all over the room. On the walls, the door, the knob, furniture, the floor, and even somehow on the ceiling. After mentioning these eyebrow-raising details to me, she downed a full shot and slammed the glass with the bar top as the tender refilled it. I actually sat there for a moment, looked at my own glass, and decided to take a small sip. But I remained open-minded, and I even asked her if she ever had a normal day at the hospital. She was expressionless as well as silent for a moment, while she looked at the full glass that the bartender had poured for her, blinked a few times, and said that, well, there was no such thing as a perfect day. The nurses, like her, dealt with whatever the doctors and tenured aides refused to handle. And despite the pay being very good, she mentioned that she had seen a lot of disturbing and inappropriate things at her job. She then took her glass and downed it quickly before the tender asked if she was alright. as my date nodded her head and the tender poured the bottle to refill the glass once more. In terms of details as to who she was, she mentioned that she was of mixed Korean and Japanese descent, and due to the history between the two countries in Northeast Asia, her mother's Korean family and father's Japanese family didn't get along well at all, and she couldn't confide with any of them as a result. So even though she had friends to confide with and speak to, she didn't have a special someone to help fill the void in her life left by the lack of family unity to help her deal with the nursing job. I decided to excuse myself to use the bathroom because I had drank a lot trying to keep up with her. As after heading to the lavatory, I stood there for a moment at the sink and was washing my hands. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. Once I was done, I decided to head back to the bar, but she was actually speaking with someone else. Apparently, there was a bloke listening in on our entire conversation, and he was potentially trying to steal my date away from me. Once I had sat back down next to her, she bluntly mentioned that she wasn't interested in him and that I had actually caught her attention, and that she was waiting to talk with me, and according to her, more importantly, to drink with. The bartender then asked the bloke to leave as he did. I then mentioned if the both of them being my date as well as the bartender knew each other. My date mentioned that they were actually close friends. I actually felt secretly relieved that my date didn't just abandon me for someone else, as I felt reinvigorated and we continued to drink and talk. Checking the time, it was almost midnight as she finally decided to stop, as I was secretly exhausted myself, because by that time I was only there just to speak with her. I had long since finished my drink. Waving her on to the bartender, as the tender then called a cab for her. I decided to wait outside with her until her ride came. As the bartender thanked me for taking care of her, she mentioned that she was actually happy that she was speaking with me and that I was such a good listener, and I nodded my head and gave her a smile. She looked at me with tired eyes. She simply nodded. And I actually thought about it for a moment, that the entire date, I barely didn't see her smile at all. All she did was acknowledge what I had said and simply looked at me. Not long after that, a cab appeared and she got into the box seat and it drove away. I was outside the bar by myself. I just stood there for a few moments. Blinking my eyes, I wondered what the hell just happened. I then shook my head and walked back to the metro stop and waited for it to come to take me back to where I had lived at the time. Once I got back to my flat, I washed up, and when I got to my bed, I just sat on its edge, thinking about what had happened that particular night. I couldn't help but feel sad, afraid, and gobsmacked all at the same time. The next day was normal as I did my morning routine with errands and other things of my life at the time. As later on I received a text message from her on my phone mentioning that she was hoping that we could meet up again sometime soon, as I was actually somewhat neutral about the experience, and for a moment I didn't want to reply. On being the open-minded man that I was so well known for, I decided to reply, mentioning that I would actually like to see her again as well, but if it were to be just a normal dinner setting and nothing like a bar encounter as before. If she were willing to accommodate that, then I'd definitely be willing to see her again. She later replied and ranted that I didn't understand her at all, and that she needed the bars and the alcohol to de-stress herself after a hectic day at work, as well as to deal with the situations in her life, and that she didn't want to see me anymore. Once I read that text, I literally felt as if an invisible weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Later on in my life, I related the encounter to others I had known, and they had all told me that someone who used denial as a method to deal with that sort of job, as well as no real family support, as it would have all eventually destroyed her life, that it was best for me not to have been associated with her at all. After I finished my story, my younger mate actually had a somewhat scared expression on his face, as he bluntly said to me that he didn't want any awkward dates like that, and I simply replied that it's going to happen to him, just that he needed to be ready when they would eventually occur. As he shook his head again, he still had a frightened expression on his face. He lastly mentioned that he didn't want to date a nurse, and I actually laughed when he said that, but I agreed with him.